Katie Bennett arrives in Napa Valley, hoping to escape the heartbreak of her past and find solace among the peaceful lavender fields. But what starts as a search for tranquility quickly turns into a suspenseful journey as she discovers that the seemingly serene fields and her mysterious neighbor, Ethan Cross, are shrouded in dark secrets. With each chapter, the tension mounts. Who can Katie trust as the line between reality and nightmare begins to blur? And as she uncovers the truth, will she find the peace she's seeking, or will the shadows of the past consume her? The answers lie hidden in the lavender fields, but some secrets are best left undisturbed. Chapter 1: A New Beginning. Katie Bennett drove into Napa Valley with the desperate hope that this change of scenery would help her escape the ghosts of her past. The afternoon sun bathed the rolling hills in a golden glow, casting long shadows that seemed to dance across the vineyards. The drive should have been calming, but instead, it left her with a lingering sense of unease. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, like an itch just beneath the surface that she couldn't quite scratch. Her destination was a quaint, isolated cottage on the outskirts of St. Helena, surrounded by fields of lavender. It was the kind of place one might find on a postcard, charming, tranquil, and seemingly perfect for a fresh start. But as Katie pulled into the gravel driveway, a shiver ran down her spine. The house was almost too quiet, the kind of silence that pressed in on you from all sides, making the air feel thick and heavy. Stepping out of the car, Katie took a deep breath, hoping to calm her nerves. The scent of lavender hit her immediately, intense, almost overwhelming. She had always found the fragrance soothing, but this was different. It was as if the lavender was alive, creeping into her lungs and clouding her thoughts. The scent seemed to cling to her, following her as she carried her bags inside the cottage. The interior was cozy, just as the rental ad had promised, with exposed wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and large windows offering panoramic views of the surrounding fields. Yet, there was something about the place that felt wrong. The air was too still, the shadows too long, and the lavender scent too persistent. Katie had expected peace, but what she found was a growing sense of dread. As she unpacked, she tried to push the unease aside, chalking it up to nerves. But that night, as she lay in bed, the feeling only intensified. The lavender scent was even stronger now, almost suffocating. It seeped through the walls, into her clothes, her hair, her skin. She tossed and turned, unable to escape it, until finally, she slipped into a restless sleep. Her dreams were a jumble of images, dark, shadowy figures moving through endless fields of purple, their faces obscured, their whispers just out of reach. She saw a woman's silhouette, backlit by a cold, ghostly light, her movements slow and deliberate, like a puppet on strings. The dream shifted, and Katie was running through the lavender fields, but no matter how fast she went, she couldn't escape the overwhelming scent, couldn't find her way out. She woke with a start, drenched in sweat, the lavender scent still thick in the air. The morning light streamed through the curtains, but it did little to dispel the darkness of her dreams. Shaking off the lingering fear, Katie decided to explore the area, hoping that the fresh air and sunlight would clear her mind. The lavender fields were even more breathtaking in the daylight, their vibrant hues stretching as far as the eye could see. But as Katie wandered through the rows of flowers, that sense of foreboding returned. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the rustling of the lavender in the breeze. It was as if the fields were alive, watching her, waiting. And then she saw him. A man stood at the edge of the field, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair falling around his face in disheveled waves. He wore a simple, worn t-shirt and jeans, but there was something about the way he held himself that made Katie stop in her tracks. He moved through the lavender with a slow, deliberate grace, his hands brushing against the flowers as if he were drawing something out of them. There was an intensity to him, a dark energy that seemed to pulse through the air, making Katie's heart race. She couldn't make out his features from where she stood, but she could feel the weight of his gaze on her, even though he hadn't yet looked her way. It was as if he were aware of her presence, even without seeing her, and that awareness sent a shiver down her spine. She should have turned back, returned to the safety of the cottage, but something held her there, a morbid curiosity, a pull she couldn't explain. Who was he? Why did he seem so at home in this strange, unsettling place? And why did she feel as though she had seen him before, even though she was certain they had never met? As if sensing her thoughts, the man suddenly looked up, his eyes locking onto hers. The distance between them made it impossible to read his expression, but Katie felt a jolt of fear as their gazes met. For a moment, they stared at each other across the field, the lavender swaying around them like waves in a dark ocean. Then, without warning, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the lavender. Katie stood there, rooted to the spot, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't move until he was out of sight, and even then, the fear lingered, a cold knot in her stomach. She had come to Napa Valley to escape her past, but it felt like she had stepped into a nightmare instead. The cottage, the lavender, the man, they were all pieces of a puzzle she didn't want to solve, but couldn't avoid. She hurried back to the cottage, locking the door behind her, but the feeling of being watched remained. As she sat by the window, her eyes fixed on the lavender fields, she knew one thing for certain: whatever had drawn her to this place, it wasn't just a need for healing. Something darker had been waiting for her here, something that had already started to unravel the peaceful life she had hoped to find. And it all began with the scent of lavender. What do you think is hiding behind Ethan's cold exterior? Could there be more to the lavender fields than meets the eye? I'd love to hear your theories in the comment. And if you're intrigued by the mystery unfolding in Napa Valley, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to stay updated on the next chapters. Chapter 2: The Lavender Man. Katie's days in Napa Valley were a mix of serenity and growing unease. The lavender fields, while beautiful, began to feel more like a trap than a refuge. Despite her initial intentions to focus on her writing, Katie found herself distracted, her thoughts constantly drifting to Ethan Cross, the man she had seen in the lavender fields on her first day. The locals in St. Helena had plenty to say about Ethan, though their accounts were tinged with a mix of curiosity and fear. He was a man of few words, they told her, living alone in the old farmhouse on the edge of town. He rarely ventured into the village, and when he did, it was only for the bare necessities. Some whispered that he was dangerous, others that he was simply misunderstood. But none of them knew much about him, and that only fueled Katie's curiosity further. The more she learned about Ethan, the more determined she became to uncover the truth. What kind of man chose to live in such isolation, surrounded by fields of lavender that seemed to hold so many secrets? And why did she feel so drawn to him, despite the sense of danger that clung to him like a shadow? One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky and the lavender fields were bathed in an eerie golden light, Katie decided to take the first step. She had seen Ethan working in the fields earlier in the day, and she knew he would be heading back to his farmhouse soon. Gathering her courage, she walked down the dirt path that led to his property, the scent of lavender growing stronger with each step. As she approached the farmhouse, she spotted Ethan at the edge of the field, his back to her as he carefully tended to the lavender plants. He moved with the same quiet grace she had noticed before, his focus so intense that he didn't seem to notice her until she was only a few feet away. "Ethan," Katie called out, her voice hesitant. "I'm Katie Bennett. I'm staying in the cottage nearby." Ethan straightened slowly, turning to face her. His expression was unreadable, his dark eyes giving nothing away. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the silence between them thick with tension. Katie could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the scent of lavender almost suffocating in its intensity. "I've seen you around," she continued, trying to keep her voice steady. "I wanted to introduce myself. I hope I'm not intruding." Ethan's gaze flicked over her, assessing, as if he were trying to decide whether she was worth his time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a growl. "You are." Katie blinked, taken aback by the harshness of his tone. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. What do you want?" Ethan cut her off, his eyes narrowing. The words were sharp, laced with impatience. Katy hesitated, unsure of how to respond. She had expected him to be distant, but not this hostile. I wanted to get to know my neighbors, she said, forcing a smile. It's a beautiful place you have here. Ethan's expression didn't soften. It's not for sale. Katy shook her head quickly. No, I'm not, I'm just trying to be friendly. Don't, he said flatly, turning his back on her and returning to his work. You'll find nothing here worth your time. The dismissal was clear, and Katy felt a flush of embarrassment and frustration. She stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. She had never been one to give up easily, but Ethan's cold rejection stung more than she cared to admit. I didn't mean to bother you, she said finally, her voice subdued. I'll leave you alone. Ethan didn't respond, didn't even look up as she turned and walked back down the path toward her cottage. As she made her way home, the lavender scent seemed to follow her, clinging to her clothes, her hair, her skin. It was as if the fields themselves were mocking her, reminding her that she had no place here, that she was an outsider intruding on a world she didn't understand. That night, the lavender scent grew even stronger, to the point where it was almost unbearable. It seeped into every corner of the cottage, filling the air with a cloying, suffocating presence that made it hard to breathe. Katy tossed and turned, trying to escape the smell, but it was no use. The lavender was everywhere, inescapable. When sleep finally claimed her, it brought no relief. Instead, Katy was plunged into a nightmare so vivid, it felt as though she were living it. She was back in the lavender fields, but the sky was dark, the wind howling through the rows of flowers. In the distance, she saw a car speeding down a winding road, its tires screeching as it skidded on the wet pavement. The scene shifted, and suddenly she was inside the car, watching helplessly as it careened out of control. There was a woman in the driver's seat, her face pale and twisted with fear. Katy couldn't see her clearly, but she could hear her breathing, ragged and desperate. The car spun out, crashing into a tree with a sickening crunch of metal and glass. And then, silence, deafening, suffocating silence. Katy woke with a gasp, her heart pounding in her chest. The lavender scent was still there, heavy and oppressive, clinging to her like a second skin. She sat up in bed, her body trembling, the images from the nightmare still vivid in her mind. The woman's face, the crash, the silence, it all felt too real, too connected to the lavender and to Ethan. She knew now that something terrible had happened in these fields, something that Ethan was hiding. And whatever it wasn't going to stay buried for long. The lavender, with its overwhelming scent and haunting presence, was the key to understanding the darkness that surrounded Ethan, and Katy was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Chapter 3: Whispers in the Dark. The days in Napa Valley were beginning to blur into one another, a haze of lavender-scented air and unsettling dreams that left Katy more exhausted than refreshed. The cottage, once a sanctuary, now felt like a place where reality and nightmare intertwined, each one feeding into the other until it was hard to tell them apart. And at the center of it all was Ethan Cross, a man who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders, and who had somehow become the focus of her waking thoughts and her darkest dreams. The nightmares had grown more vivid, more detailed, and far more terrifying. Each night, Katy found herself trapped in that same twisting landscape, lavender fields under a stormy sky, the sound of distant screams carried on the wind. The woman's face, now clearer in her mind's eye, was etched with terror, her eyes wide with fear. And always, the car, the screech of tires, the deafening crash, the silence that followed. Katy would wake in a cold sweat, the lavender scent thick in the air, her heart pounding as though she had been the one driving that doomed car. The nightmares were too real, too connected to Ethan and this place, to be mere figments of her imagination. She knew she needed answers, but she also knew that Ethan wasn't going to give them to her willingly. Determined to piece together the truth, Katy began her own quiet investigation. She started asking subtle questions around town, careful not to raise too many suspicions. It wasn't long before she uncovered the story that everyone in St. Helena seemed to know, yet no one wanted to talk about. Ethan's wife had died in a car accident several years ago. The details were murky, the circumstances suspicious, and the whispers of foul play too numerous to ignore. The locals spoke in hushed tones about the night of the crash, how Ethan had been found wandering the lavender fields in a daze, his clothes soaked in blood. The official story was that the car had gone off the road during a storm, but there were too many unanswered questions, too many inconsistencies in the accounts. And then there were the rumors, whispers that Ethan's wife had been trying to leave him, that there had been another man, that the crash had been anything but accidental. Katie's curiosity soon morphed into obsession. She spent hours in the local library, poring over old newspaper clippings and police reports, searching for anything that might shed light on what had really happened that night. The more she learned, the more she felt the pull toward Ethan, an inexplicable connection that grew stronger with each passing day, despite the danger she knew it posed. Their encounters were brief, often tinged with tension, but there was something unspoken between them, a shared understanding that neither of them could fully articulate. Ethan remained distant, his guard up, but Katie could sense the cracks in his armor, the vulnerability he tried so hard to hide. She wanted to reach out to him, to offer comfort, but there was always something holding her back, a sense that getting too close could mean crossing a line she could never uncross. Just as she thought she was starting to break through Ethan's defenses, everything changed. It happened on a warm afternoon, the air heavy with the scent of lavender, when Katie was at the local market picking up groceries. She had been lost in thought, replaying the fragments of her latest nightmare in her mind, when she heard a familiar voice, one that made her blood run cold. Katie Bennett, right? She turned to see a man standing beside her, a broad smile on his face and an easy charm in his demeanor. He was tall, with the same dark hair and piercing eyes as Ethan, but where Ethan was all rough edges and brooding silence, this man was smooth, polished, dangerous in a way that was hard to pin down. "I'm Mason Cross," he said, extending a hand. "Ethan's brother." Katie hesitated for a moment before taking his hand, her mind racing. Ethan had never mentioned a brother. In fact, he had mentioned very little about his past at all. But here was Mason, seemingly out of nowhere, with a disarming smile that set her on edge. "Nice to meet you," Katie managed, though her voice sounded strained even to her own ears. "I didn't know Ethan had a brother." Mason chuckled, a sound that was far too smooth to be sincere. "Yeah, well, Ethan's not much of a talker, is he? Keeps to himself a lot these days." He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked at her. "But you already knew that, didn't you?" Katie felt a prickle of unease. "I'm just staying in the cottage nearby," she said, trying to keep her tone casual. "We've only spoken a few times." Mason nodded slowly, as if weighing her words. "That's so? Well, you must have made quite an impression. Ethan doesn't usually let people get that close." His smile widened, but there was something predatory about it. "You seem like the curious type. That can be dangerous around here." Before Katie could respond, Mason's expression softened, and he gave her a wink. "But don't worry. I'm sure you're just being friendly. You've got that innocent look about you." The comment left Katie unsettled, and she hurried to finish her shopping, eager to get away from Mason's unsettling presence. As she walked back to her car, she couldn't shake the feeling that Mason's arrival was no coincidence. There was a tension in the air now, a sense of impending danger that hadn't been there before. When she returned to the cottage, she found Ethan waiting for her on the porch, his expression as unreadable as ever. But there was a hardness in his eyes that she hadn't seen before, a barely contained fury that simmered just beneath the surface. "Mason's here," Ethan said, his voice tight. "I saw you talking to him." Katie nodded, unsure of what to say. "He introduced himself at the market." "I didn't know you had a brother." "There's a lot you don't know," Ethan replied, his tone cold. "And it's better that way." The words stung, but Katie couldn't let them go. "Why is he here, Ethan? What does he want?" Ethan's jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists at his sides. Mason's not here to make friends. He's here to stir up trouble, like he always does. And I need you to stay away from him. Katie opened her mouth to protest, but Ethan cut her off. I'm serious, Katie. Stay away from him. His voice was low, almost a growl, and the intensity in his eyes left no room for argument. Katie nodded slowly, but the unease in her gut only grew. She could see the fear in Ethan's eyes, the tension in his posture, and she knew that whatever was coming, it was going to be bad. Mason's arrival had changed everything. The atmosphere around the cottage had shifted, the darkness that had always seemed to lurk at the edges now creeping closer, more tangible. Katie knew that the danger was real, that the secrets she had been so determined to uncover were now threatening to consume them both. And as the night fell, bringing with it the familiar scent of lavender, Katie couldn't help but wonder if she had made a terrible mistake in coming here, if the darkness that surrounded Ethan was something she would never be able to escape. Chapter 4: Beneath the Surface. The cottage, once a sanctuary in the midst of Napa Valley's serene landscape, had become a battleground. Mason's presence was like a festering wound, spreading a toxic energy that infected everything it touched. The air was thick with tension, a palpable sense of impending doom that made every interaction feel like the calm before the storm. Katie could feel the change as soon as Mason arrived. The way he moved through the house, casual yet calculating, set her on edge. He had a way of smiling that didn't reach his eyes, a way of speaking that was both charming and menacing. It didn't take long for her to realize that beneath his easygoing exterior, Mason was hiding something dark, something dangerous. The brothers' interactions were laced with old resentments, their words sharp and cutting. Katie often found herself in the middle of their exchanges, trying to diffuse the tension but feeling increasingly out of her depth. It was clear that there was a deep-seated animosity between Ethan and Mason, one that had been festering for years. Every conversation seemed to circle back to the past, to unresolved issues that neither brother was willing to let go. Mason took every opportunity to taunt Ethan, his words dripping with insinuations and half-truths. He dropped hints about their past, carefully chosen to provoke Ethan, to push him to the edge. Katie could see the effect it had on Ethan, the way his jaw would clench, his fists would tighten, his eyes would darken with barely restrained fury. One evening, after a particularly heated argument, Mason let slip a detail that sent a shiver down Katie's spine. They had been arguing about the night of the crash, the night Ethan's wife had died. Mason had said something about not being able to stop her, a comment so loaded with implication that it left Katie reeling. Ethan's reaction was immediate and violent. He slammed Mason against the wall, his face twisted with rage. "What did you say?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Mason's smile was taunting, his eyes gleaming with a perverse pleasure. "You heard me," he said calmly, despite the precarious situation. "You know exactly what I'm talking about, don't you?" Katie watched in horror as the brothers stood locked in a silent battle of wills, the tension so thick it was suffocating. She could see the barely contained violence in Ethan, the way his body trembled with the effort to hold himself back. For a moment, she thought he might actually hit Mason, but then, just as quickly as it had come, the anger dissipated. Ethan released Mason and turned away, his expression closed off, impenetrable. "Get out," Ethan said through gritted teeth, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining control. "Get the hell out of here." Mason smirked, pushing off the wall and straightening his shirt as if nothing had happened. "Sure thing, brother," he said, his tone mocking. "But you know I'll be back." He sauntered out of the room, leaving behind a silence so heavy it was almost unbearable. Katie could hardly breathe, her mind racing with the implications of what she had just witnessed. There was more to the story of Ethan's wife's death than she had realized, something Mason knew, something he was holding over Ethan's head like a sword ready to drop. That night, the lavender scent was overpowering, almost suffocating. It seemed to invade every corner of the cottage, thick and cloying, as if it were trying to smother them. Katie couldn't escape it, and neither, it seemed, could Ethan. The tension between them had reached a breaking point, and neither of them knew how to navigate the minefield that Mason had created. They found themselves alone in the living room, the air between them charged with unspoken words and unresolved feelings. Ethan's hands were still shaking, the adrenaline from the confrontation with Mason coursing through his veins. Katie could see the turmoil in his eyes, the way he was fighting to keep everything bottled up inside. Without thinking, Katie reached out and touched his arm, a simple gesture of comfort. But the moment their skin made contact, it was as if a dam had burst. The flood of emotions they had both been holding back rushed to the surface, and before Katie knew what was happening, she was in Ethan's arms, their lips crashing together in a desperate, passionate kiss. It was a release, a way to escape the overwhelming tension and fear that had been building between them. Their kiss was frantic, filled with a need that neither of them could deny. Ethan's hands roamed over her body, pulling her closer, as if he were trying to anchor himself to something real, something tangible. For a brief moment, they were lost in each other, their connection deeper than anything Katie had ever experienced. It was as if all the fear, the anger, the pain had been channeled into this one act, this one moment of surrender. They were two people on the edge of a precipice, holding on to each other for dear life, hoping that the fall wouldn't be as terrifying as it seemed. But just as quickly as it had begun, the moment was shattered. A voice cut through the darkness, smooth and mocking, sending a jolt of fear through Katie's body. Well, isn't this cozy? Katie and Ethan pulled apart, their heads snapping toward the source of the voice. Mason stood in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame, a smug grin on his face. The sight of him there, watching them, was like a bucket of cold water thrown over them both. "How long have you been standing there?" Ethan demanded, his voice low and dangerous, his eyes narrowing with fury. "Long enough," Mason replied with a shrug, clearly enjoying the power he held in this moment. "You two looked so comfortable. I didn't want to interrupt." Katie's heart pounded in her chest as she realized the implications of Mason's words. He had been watching them, spying on them, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal himself. The violation felt like a physical blow, and she could see the same realization dawning in Ethan's eyes. "What do you want, Mason?" Katie asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to keep it steady. Mason's smile widened, and he pushed off the doorframe, taking a step closer to them. "Oh, I think you know what I want," he said, his tone dangerously playful. "I want what I've always wanted, the truth." Ethan's jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. "You don't know anything about the truth." "Don't I?" Mason shot back, his eyes gleaming with a dark satisfaction. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been keeping some pretty big secrets. And I think it's time they came out." Katie felt a chill run down her spine as Mason's words hung in the air. There was something in his tone, something sinister and knowing, that made her blood run cold. Whatever Mason was holding over Ethan, it was big enough to destroy them both. "You're bluffing," Ethan said, though there was a note of uncertainty in his voice that Katie hadn't heard before. "You don't know anything." Mason laughed, the sound harsh and cruel. "Oh, Ethan, you always did underestimate me. But not this time. This time, I have all the cards, and you're going to play by my rules." The room was filled with a suffocating silence, the weight of Mason's words pressing down on them like a heavy blanket. Katie could see the fear in Ethan's eyes, the way his bravado was beginning to crack under the pressure. Whatever secret Mason was holding, it was enough to shatter everything Ethan had tried to rebuild. And in that moment, Katie realized that their lives were about to change in ways they could never have anticipated. Mason's presence had unearthed something dark and dangerous, something that had been buried beneath the surface for far too long. As the scent of lavender grew stronger, filling the room with its suffocating presence, Katie knew that there was no turning back. The truth was about to come out, and when it did, Nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 5: A Twist of Fate. The cottage, once a haven amidst the serene lavender fields, had become a place where dark secrets thrived. Each room seemed to hold a shadow of its own, each night brought new fears, and Mason's presence only amplified the growing sense of dread. Katie could feel the change in Ethan. His once steadfast demeanor had begun to crack under the weight of Mason's manipulation. Mason, no longer content with subtle threats, now wielded the truth like a weapon, chipping away at Ethan's resolve. Katie watched as Ethan, who had once seemed so strong, began to doubt himself and everything he believed about the night his wife died. Mason's words were like poison, seeping into Ethan's mind, twisting his memories and turning his guilt into a tool of control. But Katie wasn't ready to let Mason win. She was determined to uncover the truth, to dig through the layers of deception that Mason had carefully constructed. Her investigation led her down a path of deceit and corruption that eventually revealed a horrifying connection between Mason and the fatal accident that had claimed Ethan's wife, Emily. Katie pieced together the evidence. Mason had been involved in a risky business deal that had gone wrong. The details were murky, but it became clear that Emily had discovered something she wasn't supposed to know. In an effort to protect his interests, Mason had made decisions that ultimately led to her death, even if he hadn't intended it directly. The realization hit Katie like a sledgehammer. Mason's return wasn't just a coincidence. He had come back to ensure that the truth stayed buried, to clean up the mess he had created all those years ago. And now, with Ethan growing more unstable by the day, Mason saw his chance to finish what he started. Katie knew she had to tell Ethan what she had discovered, but she also knew that it could break him. The truth was a double-edged sword, necessary, but dangerous. When she finally mustered the courage to confront Ethan, the atmosphere in the cottage was tense, almost suffocating. Ethan sat in the dimly lit living room, a glass of whiskey clutched in his hand, his eyes fixed on the fireplace. The flames flickered, casting long shadows on the walls, but the warmth did nothing to chase away the chill that had settled over the room. "Ethan, I need to talk to you," Katie began, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't look at her, his gaze still locked on the fire. "What is it, Katie?" She hesitated, the weight of what she was about to say almost too much to bear. "I've been looking into Mason's past. I found something you need to know." Ethan's grip tightened around the glass, but he remained silent, waiting for her to continue. "Mason was involved in a business deal, a bad one," Katie said, her words coming out in a rush. "Emily found out about it, and she was going to expose him. That's why the accident happened. It wasn't just an accident, Ethan. It was orchestrated." For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then Ethan turned to look at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and anguish. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I'm saying that Mason is responsible for Emily's death," Katie replied, her voice breaking. "Maybe not directly, but his actions led to it. He knew what could happen, and he let it happen anyway." Ethan's face contorted with pain, and he abruptly stood, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. The glass in his hand slipped from his grip and shattered on the floor, the sound echoing through the small cottage like a gunshot. "No," he whispered, shaking his head as if trying to rid himself of the thoughts swirling in his mind. "No, that can't be true. It can't be." Katie reached out to him, but he flinched away, as if her touch was too much to bear. "Ethan, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice filled with sorrow. "But you have to believe me." Ethan's expression hardened, and he took a step back, distancing himself from her. "Get out," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I need to think." "Ethan, please. Get out," he roared, his voice filled with a rage that made Katie's heart skip a beat. Katie had no choice but to leave, tears streaming down her face as she stepped outside into the cold night air. The lavender fields that had once seemed so peaceful now felt oppressive, the scent that lingered in the air a constant reminder of the darkness that surrounded them. She didn't know how long she stood there, her mind racing, trying to figure out what to do next. But when she heard the sound of footsteps behind her, she knew it was Ethan. "I'm not going to let him get away with this," Ethan said, his voice calm but laced with determination. "I'm going to make him pay for what he's done." Before Katie could respond, Ethan was already moving, heading toward the dark silhouette of Mason's farmhouse. Panic seized her, and she ran after him, her heart pounding in her chest. "Ethan, wait," she called out, but he didn't stop. He was a man on a mission, and nothing she said would deter him. When they reached the farmhouse, Mason was standing outside, as if he had been expecting them. His expression was unreadable, but there was a cold, calculating look in his eyes that made Katie's blood run cold. "Ethan," Mason said calmly, as if they were having a normal conversation. "What brings you here?" "You know damn well why I'm here," Ethan growled, his fists clenched at his sides. "You're going to tell me the truth. Now." Mason sighed, shaking his head as if Ethan was a child throwing a tantrum. "The truth? You already know the truth, Ethan. You've always known. You just didn't want to admit it." Ethan lunged at Mason, his anger boiling over, but Mason sidestepped him easily, grabbing Ethan by the collar and forcing him to his knees. "You're weak, Ethan," Mason sneered. "Always have been. That's why you lost everything." The sight of Ethan on the ground, at Mason's mercy, filled Katie with a surge of adrenaline. She had to do something, anything, to stop this before it spiraled out of control. "Stop it, both of you," Katie shouted, stepping between them. "This isn't going to solve anything." But neither brother listened. Mason's grip on Ethan tightened, and Ethan's expression twisted with pain and fury. The situation was spiraling, and Katie knew it was only a matter of time before someone got hurt. In a desperate move, Katie pushed Mason away from Ethan, but the momentum sent her stumbling backward. Mason recovered quickly, turning his attention to Katie, his eyes flashing with anger. "You should have stayed out of this, Katie," Mason hissed, stepping closer. "But now it's too late." Before Mason could act, Ethan surged to his feet, tackling Mason to the ground. The two brothers grappled in the dirt, their fight turning savage as years of resentment and pain came to the surface. The confrontation ended abruptly when Ethan, in a last burst of strength, shoved Mason away, sending him sprawling to the ground. But in the chaos, Ethan lost his balance and struck his head against a jagged rock hidden in the dirt. Katie's scream echoed through the night as she rushed to Ethan's side, her heart shattering at the sight of him lying motionless on the ground. Blood seeped from the wound on his head, staining the lavender blossoms beneath him. Mason staggered to his feet, breathing heavily, his expression one of shock and horror. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he muttered, backing away from the scene. But it had happened. And as Katie knelt beside Ethan, desperately trying to stop the bleeding, she knew that everything had changed. The truth had come out, but at a terrible cost, and nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 6: Shattered Glass. The days after the confrontation were a blur for Katie, filled with anxious hospital visits and sleepless nights. Ethan lay in a hospital bed, his injuries severe but stable. The sight of him, battered and bruised, tore at Katie's heart, but she knew she couldn't let herself fall apart. Mason was still out there, and the danger was far from over. The sterile white walls of the hospital offered little comfort as Katie sat beside Ethan's bed, holding his hand. Each day that passed without any word of Mason's whereabouts only deepened her sense of foreboding. She knew that as long as Mason was free, they were all still in grave danger. Katie's determination to stop Mason grew with each passing hour. She buried herself in research, uncovering every piece of information she could about Mason's past. It wasn't long before she discovered something that made her blood run cold. Mason had not only played a role in the crash that killed Ethan's wife, but he had also been embezzling funds from their family business for years. This revelation was a double-edged sword, both devastating and empowering. It gave Katie the strength she needed to confront Mason, knowing she was the only one who could stop him. But Mason was slippery, always managing to stay one step ahead of her. Every lead she found, Mason had already covered his tracks, leaving her feeling increasingly desperate. The pressure mounted as Katie realized she was running out of time. Mason wouldn't hesitate to strike again if it meant protecting his secrets. The final confrontation came late one night, under the cover of darkness. The lavender fields, once a place of peace, now felt ominous, shrouded in shadow. The scent of lavender was heavy in the air, almost suffocating, as Katie made her way through the rows of flowers. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, each step bringing her closer to the inevitable showdown. Mason appeared suddenly, stepping out from behind a row of lavender with a cold smile on his face. The sight of him made Katie's stomach churn, but she forced herself to stand her ground. "You've been busy," Mason said, his voice laced with mockery. "I have to admit, I didn't think you had it in you." Katie clenched her fists, determination surging through her. "It's over, Mason. I know everything about the crash, about the money you stole. You can't keep running." Mason's smile widened, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You think you've won because you dug up a few secrets? You're out of your depth, Katie." "I'm not afraid of you," Katie shot back, her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "You've hurt too many people, and I won't let you get away with it." Mason took a step closer, his expression hardening. "You're not going to stop me. No one is." Katie's pulse quickened, but she refused to back down. "You can't keep hiding from the truth, Mason. It's going to catch up with you." For a moment, Mason seemed to hesitate, as if weighing his options. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, he lunged at Katie. She barely had time to react, but her instincts kicked in, and she dodged to the side, narrowly avoiding his grasp. The chase through the lavender fields was tense and terrifying. Katie knew the terrain better than Mason did, and she used it to her advantage, weaving through the rows of lavender and ducking under branches to throw him off. But Mason was relentless, his footsteps pounding the earth behind her. Katie's mind raced as she tried to come up with a plan. She needed to stop Mason, but she was unarmed and alone, with only her wits to rely on. The fields, once her sanctuary, now felt like a labyrinth, the scent of lavender overpowering as it clung to her clothes and filled her lungs. Finally, Katie spotted an opportunity, a clearing in the middle of the fields, where the ground was uneven and full of loose dirt. She veered off the path and headed for the clearing, hoping to use the uneven terrain to her advantage. Mason followed her into the clearing, his breath ragged from the chase. Katie turned to face him, her heart pounding in her chest. She was cornered, but she refused to let fear paralyze her. "You should have stayed out of this," Mason hissed, his eyes glinting with malice. "But now you're in too deep." Katie didn't respond. Instead, she scanned the ground, searching for anything she could use to defend herself. Her gaze fell on a jagged rock, half buried in the dirt, and she quickly grabbed it, holding it tightly in her hand. Mason lunged at her again, and this time, Katie was ready. She dodged to the side and swung the rock with all her might, striking Mason on the shoulder. He let out a grunt of pain and staggered back, giving Katie a brief moment to regain her footing. But Mason wasn't finished. He shook off the pain and came at her again, more determined than ever. Katie's heart raced as she realized how dangerous he truly was. Mason was willing to do whatever it took to silence her, no matter the cost. The fight that followed was desperate and chaotic. Katie used every ounce of strength she had, dodging and striking whenever she could. The lavender fields became a battlefield, the once fragrant flowers now trampled underfoot as the two of them struggled for control. Finally, Katie saw her chance. Mason lunged at her once more, but she sidestepped him, causing him to stumble. In that brief moment of vulnerability, Katie pushed him hard, sending him sprawling to the ground. Mason landed heavily, the wind knocked out of him. Katie stood over him, breathing heavily, the rock still clutched in her hand. Mason looked up at her, his expression a mix of rage and desperation. "It's over, Mason," Katie said, her voice shaking but resolute. "You're finished." Mason glared at her, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, fear. He knew he had lost. But as he lay there, defeated, a dark smile spread across his face. "You think this changes anything?" Mason spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You're just like him. You'll never escape the past." Before Katie could react, Mason suddenly lashed out, grabbing her ankle and yanking her to the ground. The impact was jarring, and Katie gasped as the air was knocked from her lungs. But she wasn't going to let him win. Summoning every last bit of strength, Katie kicked out with her free leg, connecting with Mason's chest and sending him reeling back. She scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding in her ears, and quickly put distance between them. Mason struggled to his feet, but the fight had taken its toll on him. He was breathing heavily, his movements sluggish as he tried to regain his balance. Katie knew this was her chance. If she could just hold out a little longer, she could end this. As they faced off once more, Katie realized that the end was near. Mason was weakening, and she could see the fear in his eyes growing. He knew he had lost, but he wasn't going to go down without a fight. In one final, desperate move, Mason lunged at Katie with a wild swing. But she was ready. She sidestepped his attack and brought the rock down on his arm, forcing him to drop to his knees. Mason let out a cry of pain, clutching his arm as he fell to the ground. Katie stepped back, her breath coming in short gasps as she watched Mason writhe on the ground. She had done it, she had stopped him. But the victory felt hollow, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on her like a lead blanket. As the adrenaline began to fade, Katie felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. She sank to her knees, the rock slipping from her grasp as she stared up at the night sky. The lavender fields, once so peaceful, now felt like a graveyard, the scent of the flowers mingling with the scent of sweat and fear. But even as Katie tried to catch her breath, a nagging doubt crept into her mind. Mason's final words echoed in her ears, "You'll never escape the past." What had he meant? Was there something she had missed, something even more dangerous lurking beneath the surface? The thought gnawed at her as she waited for the authorities to arrive. Mason had been defeated, but the truth was still out there, hidden in the shadows. And as Katie looked out over the lavender fields, she knew that her journey was far from over. The battle had been won, but the war was just beginning. Chapter 7: Lavender Shadows. The days following Mason's downfall were marked by an eerie calm, as if the storm that had upended their lives had passed, leaving behind a fragile peace. But the peace was tenuous, and Katie could feel the cracks beneath the surface. Ethan's recovery was slow, his physical injuries healing at a snail's pace, but it was the emotional wounds that worried her the most. Ethan had always been strong, a pillar of quiet resolve, but the betrayal by his own brother had left him adrift, struggling to find his footing in a world that no longer made sense. Katie saw the pain in his eyes, the weight of the guilt and anger that he carried with him every day. She wanted to help him, to be there for him, but their relationship, once so full of promise, now felt fragile, like glass that could shatter at any moment. Katie spent her days caring for Ethan, tending to his injuries and trying to keep the darkness at bay. But as much as she tried to focus on the present, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lurking in the shadows. The lavender fields, once a source of beauty and peace, now felt like a constant reminder of all they had lost. The scent that had once been so soothing now seemed to carry with it a lingering sadness, a reminder of the pain that had been sown in those fields. But the lavender fields also held a secret, one that Katie was determined to uncover. She had always been curious, driven by a need to understand the world around her, and the events of the past few weeks had only heightened that curiosity. There was something about the fields, about the cottage, that felt unfinished, like a story that had yet to be fully told. One afternoon, as she was cleaning out the attic of the cottage, Katie stumbled upon an old, dusty journal hidden in the corner of a trunk. The leather cover was cracked and worn, and the pages inside were yellowed with age. As she carefully opened the journal, She realized that it had belonged to Ethan's late wife, Emily. Katie's heart pounded as she began to read the entries, her eyes scanning the delicate handwriting that filled the pages. The journal was a window into Emily's thoughts, her hopes, and her fears. But as Katie read further, she realized that the journal also held something darker, secrets that had been carefully hidden away, buried beneath layers of deception. The entries revealed that Emily had known about Mason's plans long before the night of the crash. She had been aware of his shady business dealings, of the danger he posed to their family. But what shocked Katie the most was the revelation that Emily had been a willing participant in Mason's schemes, at least at first. She had helped him cover his tracks, had kept his secrets, all in the name of protecting Ethan. But as time went on, Emily's conscience had begun to gnaw at her. The journal entries became more frantic, more desperate, as she grappled with the weight of her choices. She had wanted to protect Ethan, to keep him safe, but she had realized too late that her actions had only put him in more danger. The final entries were filled with regret, with the haunting knowledge that she had played a part in the events that would ultimately lead to her death. Katie's hands trembled as she closed the journal, her mind reeling from the revelations. She felt a deep, aching sadness for Emily, a woman who had been caught in a web of lies and deceit, who had tried to do the right thing but had been consumed by the darkness around her. But the journal also left Katie with a sense of unease, a nagging doubt that she couldn't shake. Emily had known about Mason's plans, had been complicit in them for a time. What did that mean for Ethan? Had he known as well? Had he been aware of the danger that was lurking just beneath the surface of their lives, or had he been as blindsided as Katie had been? The questions swirled in Katie's mind, leaving her with a sense of uncertainty that threatened to unravel everything she thought she knew. As the days passed, Katie found herself growing more distant from Ethan. She couldn't bring herself to share what she had discovered in Emily's journal, not yet. She needed time to process it, to understand what it meant for her and for their future. But the distance between them only grew, a silent chasm that neither of them knew how to bridge. Ethan, sensing Katie's withdrawal, became more withdrawn himself. He spent hours staring out at the lavender fields, lost in his own thoughts. Katie watched him from the window, her heart aching with the knowledge that the man she loved was slipping away from her. She wanted to reach out to him, to tell him everything, but the fear of what it might do to him, to them, held her back. One evening, as the sun was setting and the lavender fields were bathed in a soft, golden light, Katie finally gathered the courage to confront Ethan. She found him sitting on the porch, a distant look in his eyes as he gazed out at the horizon. "Ethan," Katie began, her voice soft but steady. "We need to talk." Ethan turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. "What is it, Katie?" Katie took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "I found something. In the attic. It's a journal, Emily's journal." Ethan's eyes widened slightly, but he remained silent, waiting for her to continue. She knew about Mason's plans," Katie said, her voice trembling. "She was involved, at least for a while. But she realized it was wrong, and she tried to stop him. That's why she confronted him. That's why she died." Ethan's face drained of color, his hands gripping the arms of the chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "She knew," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "She knew, and she didn't tell me?" Katie nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Ethan. I didn't want to tell you, but I couldn't keep it from you. You deserve to know the truth." Ethan looked away, his gaze fixed on the lavender fields that stretched out before them. The silence between them was heavy, filled with the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. After what felt like an eternity, Ethan finally spoke. "She was trying to protect me," he said, his voice hoarse. "But she didn't realize that she was only making things worse." Katie reached out and took Ethan's hand, squeezing it gently. "You couldn't have known, Ethan. None of this is your fault." Ethan turned to look at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and sorrow. "But it is, Katie. I should have seen it. I should have known that something was wrong. But I was so caught up in everything else. I didn't see what was right in front of me. Katie shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. You couldn't have known, Ethan. You loved her, and you trusted her. That's not a crime. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers for some sign of comfort, of reassurance. But all he found was the same pain, the same uncertainty that he felt inside. I don't know if I can ever move past this, Katie, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can ever forgive myself. Katie's heart broke at his words, but she knew that this was a journey he would have to take on his own. She could be there for him, she could support him, but the path to healing was one that he would have to walk himself. The days that followed were filled with a quiet, uneasy peace. Katie and Ethan tried to rebuild their lives, to find a new sense of normalcy in the wake of everything that had happened. But the shadows of the past still lingered, casting a pall over their every move. One afternoon, as they were walking through the lavender fields, Ethan suddenly stopped, his gaze fixed on a spot in the distance. There's something I need to show you, he said quietly, taking Katie's hand and leading her to a secluded corner of the field. As they approached, Katie saw what had caught his attention, a small, weathered stone, partially hidden by the lavender. Kneeling down, Ethan brushed away the dirt, revealing an inscription on the stone. It was a memorial, dedicated to Emily. The words etched into the stone were simple, but they carried a profound weight, in memory of Emily, who gave her life to protect those she loved. Katie felt a lump rise in her throat as she read the words, the reality of everything they had lost washing over her in a wave of emotion. Emily planted these fields, Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. She wanted to create something beautiful, something that would last. But now it feels like they're haunted. Katie looked at Ethan, seeing the pain in his eyes, the deep scars that Mason's betrayal had left behind. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that there would be no easy answers. But as she stood there with Ethan, the scent of lavender heavy in the air, she realized that they were still standing, still fighting. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As Katie and Ethan stand at the edge of the lavender fields, the past still casts long shadows over their future. What do you think happens next? Could they ever truly leave the past behind? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'm curious to know how you imagine their story continues. And if you enjoyed the journey, please like and subscribe to join me on more thrilling adventures.